morning, class. Today we are going to begin learning about the American Civil War and slavery. What do you know about slavery? For example, what kind of work did slaves have to do?
Slaves worked in the cotton fields and tobacco fields. Some of them also worked in the houses to clean and cook.
Were their masters kind to them?
Masters were not often kind to them. They beat and killed them.
Were slaves allowed to marry?
They were not allowed to marry because the master stole them as property.
Did they ever try to escape?
They often tried to escape, and some accomplished and some failed.
Have you ever heard of the Underground Railroad? In the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Historians believe between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom. They traveled on what became known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, of course, wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secure ways slaves made their way from the south to the north. The fugitives hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in the summer and icebound rivers in the winter. Now that you've answered the questions I asked, I'm going to read to you Henry's Freedom Box, a true story from the Underground Railroad by Ellen Levine and Kadar Nelson. This book is about Henry Box Brown, one of the most famous slaves of the Underground Railroad, who mailed himself to freedom. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birth dates. Henry and his brother and sisters worked in a big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees, like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would free them. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I am giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he did not say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. "If you make a mistake, the boss will beat you." Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves did not dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both of their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, then another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owners shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped his tears, She too was gone. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought of being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man that thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there will be no slaves," he said. James stared at the box. And Henry, "What if you cough or someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up, with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it onto his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready," he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box onto the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. He slid across the deck. Now he was on his right side, now his left, and suddenly right side up. "What do you think is in this box?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry. "I'm just not the kind they imagine." Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time right side up. He fell asleep to the rattling of the train wheels. He awoke to a loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." That concludes the story of Henry Box Brown and his travels to freedom. Hello, class. In Lesson 2, we will discuss the causes that led to the American Civil War, also known as the War Between the States. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865 and led to over 618,000 casualties. Its causes can be traced back to the tensions that formed early in the nation's history. The first cause we will discuss is the economic and social differences between the North and the South. With Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton became very profitable. This machine was able to reduce the time it took to separate seeds from the cotton. However, at the same time, the increase in the number of plantations willing to move from other crops to cotton meant the greater need for a larger amount of cheap labor, which was slaves. Thus, the Southern economy became a one-crop economy, depending on cotton and therefore on slavery. On the other hand, the Northern economy was based more on industry than agriculture. In fact, the northern industries were purchasing the raw cotton and turning it into finished goods. This disparity between the two set up a major difference in economic attitudes. The South was based on the plantation system, while the North was focused on city life. This change in the North meant that society evolved as people of different cultures and classes had to work together. On the other hand, the South continued to hold on to an antiquated social order. The next cause that led to the war between the states was state rights versus federal rights. Since the time of the Revolution, two camps emerged, those arguing for greater state rights and those arguing that the federal government needed to have more control. The first organized government in the U.S. after the American Revolution was under the Articles of Confederation. The 13 states formed a loose confederation with a very weak federal government. However, when problems arose, the weakness of the Articles caused the leaders of the time to come together at the Constitutional Convention and create, in secret, the U.S. Constitution. Strong supporters of state rights, like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, were not present at this meeting. Many felt that the new Constitution ignored the rights of states to continue to act independently. They felt that the states should still have the right to decide if they were willing to accept certain federal acts. This resulted in the idea of nullification, whereby the states would have the right to rule federal acts unconstitutional. The federal government denied states this right. However, supporters such as John C. Calhoun fought passionately for nullification. When nullification would not work and the states felt they were no longer respected, they moved toward secession. Another cause that led to the American Civil War was the fight between slave and non-slave state supporters. As America began to expand, first with the lands gained from the Louisiana Purchase and later with the Mexican War, the question of whether new states admitted to the Union would be free or slave. The Missouri Compromise, passed in 1820, made a rule that prohibited slavery in states from the former Louisiana Purchase, the latitude 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, except in Missouri. During the Mexican War, conflicts started about what would happen with the new territories that the U.S. gained upon victory. David Wilmot proposed the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, which would ban slavery in the new lands. However, this was shot down to much debate. The Compromise of 1850 was created by Henry Clay and others to deal with the balance between slave and free states, northern and southern interest. One of the provisions was the Fugitive Slave Act. Another issue that further increased tensions was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It created two territories that would allow the states to use popular sovereignty to determine whether they would be free or slave. The real issue occurred in Kansas, where pro-slavery Missourians began to pour into the state to help force it to be slave. They were called border ruffians. Problems came to a head in violence at Lawrence, Kansas. The fighting that occurred caused it to be called Bleeding Kansas. The fight even erupted on the floor of the Senate when the anti-slavery supporter Charles Sumner was beat over the head by South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks. Another reason for the war between the states was the growth of the abolition movement. Increasingly, the Northerners became more polarized against slavery. Sympathies began to grow for abolitionists and against slavery and slaveholders. This occurred especially after some major events, including the publishing of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Dred Scott case, John Brown's raid, and the passage of the Fugitive State Act that held individuals responsible for harboring fugitive slaves, even if they were located in non-slave states. The last cause we are going to discuss for the American Civil War was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Even though things were already coming to a head, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, South Carolina issued its Declaration of the Causes of Secession. They believed that Lincoln was anti-slavery and in favor of Northern interests. Before Lincoln was even president, 7 states had seceded from the Union. They included South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas.
Ready? Present. Fire!
Hello, class. In Lesson 3, we are going to discuss some of the major events that occurred during the Civil War. The first major event we are going to discuss is the succession of the Confederate States. The Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy, was a government set up from 1861 to 1865 by a number of the southern slave states that declared their succession from the United States. The Confederacy included South Carolina, which was the first to succeed. Then there was Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The president of the Confederate States of America was Jefferson Davis. The capital of the Confederacy was in Montgomery, Alabama until 1861, when it was relocated to Richmond, Virginia, where it remained until 1865. The next major event of the American Civil War we're going to discuss was the battle at Fort Sumter. On Friday, April the 12th, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate batteries opened fire, firing for 34 straight hours on the fort. Lieutenant Henry S. Farley, commanding a battery of 2 mortars on James Island, fired the first shot at 4:30 a.m. No attempt was made to return the fire for more than 2 hours. The fort's supply of ammunition was not suited for the task. Also, There were no fuses for their explosive shells. Only solid balls could be used against the rebel batteries. At about 7 o'clock a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday, the fort's second in command, was given the honor of firing the first shot in defense of the fort. The firing continued all day. The Union fired slowly to conserve ammunition. At night, the fire from the fort stopped, but the Confederates still lobbed an occasional shell in Fort Sumter. On Saturday, April the 13th, the fort was surrendered and evacuated. During the attack, the Union colors fell. Lieutenant Norman J. Hall risked his life and limb to put them back up, burning off his eyebrows permanently. A Confederate soldier bled to death, having been wounded by a misfiring cannon. One Union soldier died, and another was mortally wounded during the 47th shot of the 100-shot salute allowed by the Confederacy. The next event we're going to speak of is the First Battle of Bull's Run, also known as First Manassas, the name used by the Confederate forces. The battle was fought on July the 21st, 1861, in Prince Williams County, Virginia, near the city of Manassas. It was the first major land battle of the American Civil War. Bull Run was the largest and bloodiest battle in American history up to that point. Union casualties were 460 killed, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 missing or captured. On the Confederate side, the casualties included 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing. This was the first Confederate victory, led by Confederate Commander P.G.T. Beauregard. The Union commander at the Battle of Bull Run was Irvin McDowell. The next event of importance was the Battle of Antietam, which was fought on Wednesday, September the 17th, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and Antietam Creek as part of the Maryland Campaign. It was the first major battle in the American Civil War to take place on Union soil. It was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, with 22,717 dead, wounded, and missing on both sides combined. After pursuing Confederate General Robert E. Lee into Maryland, Union Army Major General George B. McClellan launched attacks against Lee's army and in defensive positions behind Antietam Creek. Although the battle was tactically incisive, it had enough significance to give President Abraham Lincoln the confidence to announce his Emancipation Proclamation. Next, we will discuss the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an order issued to all segments of the executive branch, including the Army and the Navy of the United States, by President Abraham Lincoln on January the 1st, 1863, during the American Civil War. It was based on the President's constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. It proclaimed all those enslaved in Confederate territories to be free forever, and ordered the Army and all segments of the executive branch to treat as free all those enslaved in 10 states that were still in the rebellion. This proclamation could not be enforced in area still under rebellion, but as the Army took control of Confederate regions, the slaves in those regions were emancipated rather than being returned to their masters. The next event of importance is the Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought July the 1st through July the 3rd, 1863, in and around the towns of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was the battle with the largest number of casualties in the American Civil War, and it often described as the war's turning point. Union Major General George Meade, Army of the Potomac, defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee of Northern Virginia, ending Lee's invasion of the North. The Gettysburg Address is the next event of importance. The Gettysburg Address is a speech delivered by Lincoln during the American Civil War on the afternoon of Thursday, November the 19th, 1863, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This was 4.5 months after the Union armies defeated those in the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg. In just over 2 minutes, Lincoln reiterated the principles of human equality espoused by the Declaration of Independence and proclaimed the Civil War as a struggle for the preservation of the Union by the succession crisis with a new birth of freedom that would bring true equality to all its citizens, ensuring that democracy would remain a viable form of government and creating a nation in which state rights were no longer dominant. Lincoln also redefined the American Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union, but also for the principle of human equality.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The next major event of importance in the American Civil War was Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman's March to the Sea is the name commonly given to the Savannah campaign conducted through Georgia November the 15th to December the 21st, 1864, by Major General William Sherman of the Union Army in the American Civil War. The campaign began with Sherman's troops leaving the captured city of Atlanta, Georgia on November the 16th, and ended with the capture of the port of Savannah on December the 21st. Sherman's forces destroyed military targets as well as industry, infrastructure, and civilian property. Sherman felt that everything should be burnt, therefore leaving Georgia in complete destruction. The final major event we are going to discuss is the Battle of the Appomattox Courthouse. The Battle of the Appomattox Courthouse was fought on the morning of April the 9th, 1865, which was the final engagement of the Confederate States Army General Robert E. Lee Army of North Virginia before it surrendered to the Union Army under Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant in one of the last battles of the Civil War. Lee's final stand was at Appomattox Courthouse, where he launched an attack to break through the Union's forces to his front, assuming the Union force consisted entirely of cavalry. When he realized that the cavalry was backed up by 2 corps of Union infantry, he had no other choice but to surrender. The signing of the surrender documents occurred in the parlor of the house owned by Wilmer McClellan on the afternoon of April the 9th. On April the 12th, a formal ceremony marked the disbandment of the Army of Northern Virginia and the patrols of its officers and men, eventually ending the war. While General George Meade reportedly shouted that it's all over upon hearing the surrender was signed, Grant was aware that only a single army had given up. Roughly 175,000 Confederates remained in the field. Many of these were scattered throughout the South in garrisons, while the rest were concentrated in 3 major Confederate commands. Just as Porter Alexander had predicted, it was only a matter of time before the other Confederate armies began to surrender. As news spread of Lee's surrender, other Confederate commanders realized that the strength of the Confederacy was fading and decided to lay down their own arms. General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina, the most threatening of the remaining Confederate armies, surrendered to Major General William T. Sherman at Bennett's Place in Durham, North Carolina on April the 26th. General Taylor surrendered his army in Alabama in early May, followed by General Edmund Smith surrendering the Confederate Trans-Mississippi Department in May near New Orleans, Louisiana. General Stan Waddy surrendered the last sizable organized Confederate force on June the 23rd, 1865. There were several more small battles after the surrender, with the Battle of Palmetto Ranch commonly regarded as the final military action of the Confederacy. The years following the Civil War between 1865 and 1877 are known as the Reconstruction era. The reason historians use the term Reconstruction is because this was the period when the federal government restored the seceded states to the Union. This proved to be a difficult and contentious process. The federal government had to deal with 3 main issues. 1. How to deal with the states as they rejoined the Union. 2. How Southern whites should be treated. And 3. How to deal with the free slaves. Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan. Abraham Lincoln had created a plan for Reconstruction that was opposed by Congress. His plan was based on the idea that the states never really seceded from the Union, and therefore they should not necessarily be punished. It concluded 2 major provisions. 1. Pardons of Southerners who participated in the war if they took an oath of allegiance to the United States. 2nd, readmission of a state if 10% of the white voters in that state took the oath of allegiance to the United States, and it created a new government that guaranteed the end of slavery. When Lincoln was assassinated, his successor, President Andrew Johnson, decided to adopt Lincoln's plan. He not only pardoned all Southerners who took the oath, except for a few key Confederate leaders, He also recognized the state governments of 4 states that Lincoln had created and appointed temporary governors for the other southern states. Great strides were made towards Reconstruction by the end of 1865, as only one southern state had not set up a new government that abolished slavery: the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, adopted between 1865 and 1870, the 5 years immediately following the Civil War. The amendments were important elements in implementing the reconstruction of the American South after the war. Their supporters saw them as transforming the United States from a country that it was, half slave and half free, to one in which the constitutional guaranteed blessing of liberty would be extended to the entire male populace, including the former slaves and their descendants. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment included the Privileges or Immunities Clause, Due Process, and Equal Opportunity Clauses. The 15th Amendment grants voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment did not include women. It took another amendment, the 19th Amendment, to grant women the right to vote. These amendments were intended to guarantee freedoms and civil rights to African Americans. The promise of these amendments was eroded by state laws and federal court decisions. The states passed Jim Crow laws that limited the rights of African Americans. Important Supreme Court cases that undermined these amendments were the Slaughterhouse cases, which prevented rights guaranteed underneath the 14th Amendment, Plessy Ferguson, which gave federal approval to Jim Crow laws. The full benefits of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not realized until Supreme Court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education and laws such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Congress reacts to Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. Congress, especially a group called the Radical Republicans, did not agree with Johnson's actions. In fact, they would not allow the newly elected Southern representatives and senators join Congress in December of 1865. Instead, they decided to enact their own Reconstruction Plan. It consisted of the following items. First, the creation of a Freedmen's Bureau to help newly free slaves. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, usually referred to as simply the Freedmen's Bureau, was a U.S. federal government agency that aided distressed freedmen, which were free slaves, in 1865 through 1872. But it was very weak by 1870 during the Reconstruction era of the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which created the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865, was initiated by President Abraham Lincoln and was intended to last for 1 year after the end of the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau was an important agency of early Reconstruction, assisting freedmen, which were freed ex-slaves in the South. The Bureau was part of the United States Department of War. It was headed by Union Army General Oliver O. Howard. The Bureau was operational from 1865 to 1872. It was disbanded under President Ulysses S. Grant. The Bureau encouraged former plantation owners to rebuild their plantation, urging African Americans to gain employment, keep an eye on contracts between labor and management, and push both whites and blacks to work together as employers and employees rather than masters and slaves. Second was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to help protect freedmen from laws such as black codes that were being passed in many southern states. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, enacted April the 9th, is a U.S. federal law that was mainly intended to protect the civil rights of African Americans in the wake of the American Civil War. The act was enacted by Congress in 1865, but vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. In 1866, Congress again passed the bill. Although Johnson again vetoed it, a two-thirds majority in each house overcame the veto and the bill became law. The Black Codes were laws in the United States passed after the Civil War with the effect of limiting the civil rights and the civil liberties of blacks. Even though discrimination laws against blacks existed in both northern and southern states from the early 19th century, the term Black Codes is used more often to refer to legislation passed by southern states at the end of the Civil War to control labor and movement of newly freed slaves. During 1865, every southern state passed black codes that restricted the freedmen who were emancipated but not yet full citizens. These codes granted African Americans certain rights, such as legalized marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to the courts, but denied them the right to testify against whites, to serve on juries or in state militia, or to vote and express legal concerns publicly. Some also declared that those who failed to sign yearly labor contracts could be arrested and hired out to white landowners. Several states limited the occupations open to African Americans and barred them from acquiring land, and others provided that judges could assign African American children to work for their former owners without the consent of their parents. Number 3, passage of the 14th Amendment, the purpose of which was to ensure that future legislatures could not revise the Civil Rights Act. Number 4 was passage of the Reconstruction Acts that made restoration of the Union more difficult. After the end of the American Civil War, as part of the ongoing process of Reconstruction, the United States Congress passed 4 statutes known as the Reconstruction Acts. The actual title of the initial legislation was an act to provide for a more efficient government of the rebel states. It was passed on March 2, 1867. Fulfillment of the requirement of the acts were necessary for the former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union. The acts excluded Tennessee, which had already ratified the 14th Amendment and had been readmitted to the Union. States readmitted. 7 states were readmitted to the Union in 1868. When Congress prepared the 15th Amendment in 1868, it required the rest of the states to ratify this amendment to be readmitted. All states were eventually readmitted by 1870. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president and supported Congress's Reconstruction plans. The Compromise of 1877. Southern white Democrats were eventually able to regain control of the state and local governments as more ex-Confederates were given the right to vote after the war, and the fear of violence kept many freedmen away. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, ran against each other for president. Tilden won the popular vote, but the electoral vote was disputed. An electoral commission convened and gave all the votes to Hayes. Democrats agreed to support this decision if all federal troops were removed from the South. They agreed, and military rule in the former Confederate states ended in 1877. This is known as the Compromise of 1877.